What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source? For me, it's,
If you make eye contact with me again, I will pluck your eyeballs out, stick my unwashed fingers into the holes, and then drag your fucking face across this parking lot. From my first sergeant, when I got to my first unit.
what's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
The weight of my sins drags me closer to hell, but I sit in a throne that is higher than God's. From a Tumblr post about being lactose intolerant. It's also what I tell myself every morning when I look into the mirror.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
This is a bit of an obvious one, but it has to be said. The phrase, "I will face God and walk backwards into hell," is so iconic, it's easy to forget it's not from a piece of late 20th century poetry. It is, in fact, from a drill tweet about yelling at zoo animals.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
Everything not saved will be lost. You know who said that? Nintendo said that.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
Signs is never lie, cheat, steal, or drink. But if you must lie, lie in the arms of the one you love. If you must steal, steal away from bad company. And if you must cheat, cheat death. And if you must drink, drink in the moments that take your breath away. And that's Hitch, Will Smith in Hitch. Wow.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source? For me,
I see now that the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. It's what you do with the gift of life that determines who you are. Mewtwo said that in the Pokemon movie.
what's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source? For me, it's, the key is to realize that life is temporary, and spending life questioning life is a waste of time. From Fred Durst of Limp Bizkit. What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
So in the second episode of Dimension 20's Fantasy High, Riz Gutgak crawls up the asshole of a corn monster. By the end of that season of Fantasy High, Brennan Lee Mulligan drops one of the rawest universal truths, and that was, in the same way that your heart feels and your mind thinks, you, mortals, are the instruments by which the universe cares. And if you care, then the universe cares. And if you don't, it doesn't. So.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
So I'm currently going through and watching a bunch of B tier, C tier anime because I want to watch the A and S tier ones with my partner, right? Which means I recently watched Assassination Classroom. It was okay, it was really just something to have on, but I did not expect this heater. At some point in the show, the yellow squid monster with a permanent smile and an obsession with porn says, the difference between the novice and the master is that the master has failed more times than the novice has even tried. Oh my god! And then they just make a joke about, ooh, titties, and it's like, what are we watching?
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
Why did they despise me so? I created them. Do you think God stays in heaven? Because he too lives in fear of what he's created here on Earth? That's from Spy Kids 2.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
Tell your boyfriend that if he says he has beef, that I'm a vegetarian and I ain't fucking scared of him. 303.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
No offense whatsoever, but I thought you were Bo Burnham until I put my glasses on. And now to me, you just kind of look like Bo Burnham described by someone who saw him once. If that makes sense. Anyway, my quote is, if you're dumb and don't know something but don't ask, you're still dumb and don't know something. Where did I get that from? Fuck if I know.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
It's not my favorite of all time, but I think it's a good one. It's from The Wicked and the Divine, a comic book series about gods from all kinds of different mythologies from all over the world. And the quote is, and patriarchy isn't rule by men, it's rule by fathers. Most men will never be the fathers, they're just sons. and sons get sacrificed to keep the old man in port and cigars. I think it's just very on the head with what patriarchy is.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
Authority should derive from the consent of the governed, not by the threat of force. Barbie, Toy Story 3.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
So this is actually from Benjamin Button. Brad Pitt says it towards the end of the movie. He says, "For what it's worth, it's never too late, or in my case, too early to be whoever you want to be. There's no time limit. Stop whenever you want. You can change or stay the same. There are no rules to this thing. We can make the best or the worst of it. And I hope that you make the best of it. And I hope that you see things that startle you. And I hope you meet people with a different point of view. I hope you live a life that you're proud of. If you find that you're not, I hope you have the courage to start all over again." Y'all have a good day.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
The past makes you want to die out of regret, and the future makes you depressed out of anxiety. So by elimination, the present is likely to be the happiest time. When I tell you, it was 2 o'clock in the morning and I was watching a random ass harem anime, and I was just like, bro, I just thought this shit was gonna be funny because they all are funny. That shit hit me in my chest. I will never forget that shit ever, bro.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
Decay exists as an extant form of life. From this Tumblr post. Me holding a gun to a mushroom. Tell me the name of God, you fungal piece of shit. Mushroom, can you feel your heart burning? Can you feel the struggle within? The fear within me is beyond anything your soul can make. You cannot kill me in a way that matters. Me cocking the gun, tears streaming down my face. I'm not fucking scared of you. Hey, LP, what the fuck does this mean? Decay exists as an extant form of life. That's a terrifying answer. Have a nice day.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
Pi. The ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter, and this is just the beginning. It keeps on going forever without ever repeating, which means that contained within this string of decimals is every single other number. Your birth date, combination to your locker, your social security number, it's all in there somewhere. And if you convert these decimals into letters, you would have every word that ever existed in every possible combination. The first syllable you spoke as a baby, the name of your latest crush, your entire life story from beginning to end, everything we ever say or do, all of the world's infinite possibilities rest within this one simple circle. Now, what you do with that information, what it's good for, well, that would be up to you. Person of Interest, Season 2, Episode 11, Harold Finch. I have a pie tattoo.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
So last year, I worked a summer job, and on the last day of our training, our trainer said something that has stuck with me ever since. Now, he was talking about how if you can have a good day, but if you slack off during like the last hour of your shift and an accident happens, you kind of mess up the day. So the phrase he used was, "How it ends is how it was. How it ends is how it was." And I know that he was talking about work, but ever since I've heard that phrase, I've realized that human beings apply that phrase to almost everything. If I'm in a romantic relationship for 2 years and 23 out of the 24 months are great, but the last month ends horribly, I tend to categorize the whole thing as bad because it ended badly, so the whole thing was bad. Same goes for jobs. And ever since I've heard that phrase, I've been able to start looking at things differently and being like, did this just end bad or was the whole thing bad? And a surprising amount of the time, it just ended bad, but I think of the whole thing that way.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up. Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life. It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line. Hopper, a Bug's Life.
What's your favorite surprisingly deep quote from an unlikely source?
So I used to work at Kohl's, and I hated it. I was having a really crappy day one day, and this old man comes up to me. He comes up to me and he says, have you ever wanted to do something, but you just never got around to it? And the way that he asked it was really weird. I was like, something weird's about to happen. And I just looked at him and I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, I think we've all felt like that at some point. And then, just out of nowhere, he took his hands out of his pocket and he goes, here. And it was like, you want to know what it is? It's a round to it. So every time that I think to myself, I'll get around to it, it's like, well, I already have one. I hope that guy's doing okay.